But by that point, police have been so married to this culture of enacting the bourgeois power that you can't really remove it at this point. And police reform since the 1950s, all the taking away from political machines was wrapped up by the 1950s. But since the 1950s, there hasn't really been a lot of police reform. And you can see this especially with police brutality against Black Americans that we still see today. And you can especially see reminiscence of the slave patrols in the fact that in cities like Ferguson with a majority Black population, there's a majority white police officers. And that really doesn't feel right, and it really feels reminiscent of slave patrols. So now we're talking about the role of prisons in the United States. Foucault, if anyone knows who he is, he's a French philosopher from the postmodern era. He wrote a book called Discipline and Punishment, The Birth of Prison, and he basically makes the argument that at the end of the 1700s and early 1800s, people were just kind of tired of how punishment had been done, which was in public. So they would either put you on like a medieval chain gang, or they would just cut your head off in public. And because of the Enlightenment, people were like, man, that's not cool. I don't want to see that. So they started making prisons. Well, they didn't start making prisons, they just kind of had them and started using them. And so the historian Adam J. Hirsch notes similarities between prisoners and slaves in the United States due to the fact that they were both doing labor they didn't want to do, directed by a person who they obviously did not like. They had no choice on what they did. And you can still see these similarities today, because if I say imagine a prisoner in the United States today, most people are going to imagine a Black man in an orange jumpsuit, because that's what our prisoning system looks like right now. And this is especially true with Angela Davis. She notes further, building off of Hirsch, that in the northern United States back in the 1800s, prisoners, regardless of race, were characterized as having a kinship to Black slaves. Because, and like I said, you still see this today, with when you imagine a prisoner, you imagine a Black man. So prisons further into the 1800s, like I mentioned, prisons in the United States began because of the fallout of public punishment. But the historian doesn't need to mention, prisons in the 1800s were a bad place to be, in case you weren't aware. They were like medieval dungeons. Sanitation was terrible, food was terrible. They were cramming like 4 people in a room that was like maybe 10 by 10, if that. So the historian David J. Rothman notes a contradiction in the United States. This is the time of Jacksonian democracy, where everyone by white men, could go vote. But he knows this contradiction of, if you're trying to expand democracy, why are you also putting everyone, or not everyone, but a lot of people in prison who are then losing their rights to vote, because you can't vote while in prison. They don't let you do that. At this time, a lot of people thought the social order was collapsing, and they thought it was due to religious morals. We're not praying to Jesus, we're not worshiping God or whatever. But in reality, what was happening was industrialization. If anyone's read the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels talk about how in industrial capitalism, it basically destroyed any sort of relationship, like in feudalism. Not that feudalism was good, but there was some element of paternalism there. Industrialization destroyed that, and it was all about cold hard cash at this point. And because of that, people were acting up. When you live in a society where you need money to survive, you're going to start committing crimes if you can't get a job. Like a lot of people couldn't get a job, or their job wasn't giving them enough. So prison reform, once again, prisons in the 1800s, not that great to be in. But there was this report in 1867 known as the shorthand, the Wines and Dwight Report, or if you're like me and sometimes you can't read, it's the Wines and Dines Report. Ran into that problem a lot while typing this paper. But this essentially kicked off the prison reform movement, and it focused on rehabilitation, but it did not focus on preventing crime. And I think this is the biggest problem with the prison reform movement, is that it never focused on prevention. From the start, it always focused on rehabilitation. Reform, whether it be rehabilitation or prevention of crime, is going to be opposed by the bourgeois. And the reason this is because within capitalism, we have a system of labor where we need a group of otherized people to do our labor, the labor that we don't want to do. And prisoners were very much an otherized group of people. Like I said, a lot of them were akin to Black slaves. A lot of them today are Black men, groups that have been highly otherized in the society. And it continues today. And so we have a continued failure of prison reform up until today, and the three reasons are mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and private prisons. Michelle Alexander, in her fantastic book, The New Jim Crow, talks about how Southern governors use the phrases like law and order to suggest that Black Americans who were protesting during the civil rights movements weren't doing it because they had any sort of political agenda, such as please stop killing us, but because they wanted to have a world where they could just run around and commit crime. It's a very silly logic, it doesn't really make sense, but that's what these people were thinking. And essentially, this racial coding of like law and order continued with the war on drugs, exploiting stereotypes of Black Americans as drug users and dealers that had existed in the 1930s, and had existed since then. And so they use these stereotypes to police, to put these communities into prison, and to create this otherized labor force. And so the war on drugs has an overwhelming amount of Black Americans in prisons, and this leads to more and more private prisons, because the more prisoners you have, the more money that the state is going to dedicate to prisons, and the state decides, let's have private prisons and let's let someone else do all the work that we don't want to do, and we'll just give them some money. As you can see here, this is from 2013. I can give more current numbers, but they haven't changed that much. Non-Hispanic Blacks and the male prison population makes up 37%, which if you look at the population statistics of the United States, those numbers don't match up. White Americans are the overwhelming part of the majority, and we only make up 32% of people in jail. Black Americans are only roughly about 13% of the population, and they make up 37%. And this isn't on accident, this is done on purpose, because the way the prison system and the policing system has been set up is to do this to Black Americans. And so we get to this question of reformation or abolition. And I think there's very few solutions for police abolition. And essentially, the best I found was by a man, Alex Vitale, as I speak here, not here, but in the area. And he wrote this book called The End of Policing, and essentially proposes a radical reformism where he talks about community programs such as job programs, school programs, wellness programs, mental health programs, to try and prevent crime, with the idea that when we build these institutions to prevent crime, we essentially won't need the police in the future to run around and stop criminals, because the crime that police are most focused on today aren't happening. A lot of people have this question of like, what about serial killers? Serial killers don't make up that most people in prisons or people get arrested. It's non-violent drug offenders, and it's people with mental health issues that the police are sent to solve rather than a social worker. Prison abolition, however, as Angela Davis wrote about, I think is actually possible. I don't think we're going to be able to do it tomorrow, but we already have systems in place that can make prison abolition possible. Angela Davis puts forth this concept of decarceration, where we use our current institutions, such as schools, mental health facilities, and things of that nature, to provide to the populations that experience prison most. The biggest indicator of whether you are going to go to prison or not is poverty. And when we have programs that help people in poverty in schools and areas, regardless of race, where they're very impoverished, when we have these programs, these people aren't going to end up in prison, because there's essentially like the school to prison pipeline. I'm sure people have heard about that in here. It's essentially when you criminalize someone in school, they're going to commit crimes because they don't really think about life in any other way. They're used to being criminalized, they're used to being otherized. When we create systems that don't do that to people, they don't think of themselves as a criminal. And they shouldn't think of themselves as a criminal to begin with, because they're not criminals. They're just people trying to survive who have been told by people in power that this is your life now. And so I'm gonna end this with a quote. Did not steal this idea from Isaac, he stole it from me, just for the record. But it's from my favorite American socialist, C.G. Dubs. While there is a lower class, I am in it. And while there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not for you. As I stand before everyone today, I imagine a society where we don't need police and prisons. Frankly, I think police and prisons are very terrible, and I would use some swear words, but that's not polite, so I won't. But prisons and police are very bad for society. If you really think about it, at the end of the day, what are police and prisons doing for us? They're not doing a lot. They're not keeping these bad people out of our society, because those bad people in our society are the neighbors we know. They're our family members. They're people that we love and care about. They're not this, mythical demon beast. They're normal people. They need compassion. And so with policing and prison systems, we're not giving these people the compassion that they deserve. So that's the end of my presentation.